On a quiet Monday morning in the heart of a small southern town, the sun was just beginning to rise over the courthouse and sleepy storefronts lining Main Street. Most folks were just starting their day, opening coffee shops, sweeping sidewalks, and catching up on town gossip. But something unusual was about to unfold outside the local police station, something no one could have predicted. A sleek black SUV pulled up along the curb. Out stepped a tall black man, dressed sharply in a tailored navy blue suit. He carried himself with purpose, his back straight, his steps measured, his face calm and focused. The kind of presence that draws attention, not because he was flashy, but because he exuded quiet authority. Watching from a distance was Officer Mark Jennings, a mid-level white patrol officer with nearly a decade on the force. Jennings leaned against his cruiser with a cup of coffee in hand. He narrowed his eyes as he watched the man approach. Something about the man seemed to rub him the wrong way. Maybe it was the confidence. Maybe it was the suit. Maybe it was something uglier. Instead of welcoming the stranger or offering assistance, Officer Jennings stood upright and started walking toward him. His body language shifted, no longer relaxed, now defensive, almost confrontational. "Can I help you?" he asked, tone cold and clipped. The suited man stopped, taken aback, but not rattled. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jennings didn't wait. "You don't belong here," Jennings said firmly, his voice rising. "This isn't a place for people like you. Move along before you cause trouble." The man furrowed his brow, but kept his cool. "Officer," he began, "I think you're making." "I said move along," Jennings barked, stepping forward aggressively. And then, in a moment so charged it seemed to freeze time, Officer Jennings spat directly at the man's feet. A thick glob of spit landed on the ground, inches from his polished leather shoes. The man looked down, then up, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate. Instead, he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. Jennings flinched slightly, unsure of what was coming. But there was no weapon, only a document. The suited man gave a subtle shake of his head and continued walking past the stunned officer, headed straight for the doors of the police station. Officer Jennings watched him go, still convinced he had just dealt with some big city attorney or maybe an activist trying to stir things up. Either way, he felt satisfied with himself, believing he had put the man in his place. What he didn't know was that he had just spat at his new boss. That sharply dressed black man? His name was David Robinson, a 25-year law enforcement veteran, nationally recognized for leading police reform initiatives, community outreach programs, and bridging gaps between cops and civilians in racially divided cities. And that folded piece of paper in his pocket? It was his official letter of appointment, naming him the new police chief of the very department Officer Jennings worked for. Jennings had no idea that the man he disrespected would soon be standing at the front of the squad room, leading the morning briefing, calling the shots, and changing the very culture that allowed officers like him to act with such unchecked arrogance. What happened in those few minutes outside the station wasn't just disrespect. It was a symbol of the deep-rooted issues the town had ignored for too long. But change had just arrived, and it was wearing a navy blue suit, unbothered on the surface, but deeply disappointed inside. The man glanced down at the small splatter of spit near his shoe. He calmly took out a handkerchief from his inner pocket, wiped his shoe with grace, and let out a long, quiet breath. He wasn't going to respond with anger. That wasn't his way. He had faced worse in his lifetime, and, sadly, he had seen this kind of behavior too often in his line of work. Straightening his suit, he turned away from the officer and made his way up the front steps of the building. As soon as he walked into the station's main lobby, a wave of attention hit him. Officers at their desks paused. Conversations stopped. Phones kept ringing unanswered. All eyes were now on the man in the blue suit. Behind a front desk, a seasoned sergeant quickly stood up, a wide smile spreading across his face. His reaction was the opposite of the one outside. "Chief Robinson." "Welcome, sir," he said with enthusiasm, extending a respectful hand. Outside, Officer Mark Jennings froze. "Chief," he muttered under his breath, as if the word had slapped him in the face. He peeked through the door's glass panel and saw the same man he had just insulted now being greeted like royalty. The color drained from his face. The realization hit hard. The man he spat at, the one he told to move along, was David Robinson, the new chief of police. Jennings' stomach twisted into a knot. Chief Robinson returned the front desk sergeant's handshake with warmth and gave a polite nod to the other staff in the room. Some recognized him from prior media coverage. Others had only seen his name mentioned in internal memos. But now, he was right here in person. Robinson had been brought in for a reason. The town's department had faced increasing pressure from the public after a series of misconduct cases and rising community tensions. They needed new leadership. They needed change. And they needed someone who had done it before. David Robinson had earned national recognition in a major city police department, where he turned a struggling force into a model of transparency and trust. He believed in real community policing, not just public relations stunts, but deep structural reform. He believed in holding officers accountable, regardless of their tenure or popularity within the force. That's why he was chosen. And that's why the mayor had decided to keep his appointment under wraps until the official announcement that very morning. And as fate would have it, Officer Jennings, whose name had come up more than once in past complaints, was the very first person to reveal exactly why this department needed new leadership. You see, Mark Jennings wasn't just any cop. He had a file thick with internal complaints, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. But like in many departments across the country, those complaints were either quietly closed or brushed aside due to lack of evidence or insufficient witness statements. Jennings had skated by for years, shielded by silence, protected by the culture. But that era was about to end. The man he had humiliated, demeaned, and spat at just minutes earlier now stood at the helm of the entire department. And Jennings? He remained just outside the doorway, completely still. A pit formed in his stomach as he began to understand what this meant for him. This wasn't just an awkward moment. It was a reckoning. Chief Robinson, still calm and composed, hadn't yet acknowledged what had happened outside. But everyone would know soon enough. Not because he'd seek revenge, but because he stood for something more powerful than ego, justice, fairness, and reform. Inside that station, something had already shifted. The man in the blue suit wasn't just another officer. He was the new standard, and Jennings had just failed it before the first official meeting had even begun. The meeting room was packed. Rows of uniformed officers sat at attention, clipboards in hand, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Some whispered quietly among themselves, curious about what kind of man their new police chief would be. Others scrolled through their phones, expecting another long-winded speech from an outsider who didn't really understand their town. But the moment Chief David Robinson walked in, the room shifted. He didn't rush. He didn't bark orders. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the podium. His presence was calm, but commanding. Every eye in the room gradually turned to him, and by the time he reached the front, the room had fallen silent. Everyone except Officer Mark Jennings. He sat stiffly in the far right corner of the room, half hidden behind two taller officers. His stomach churned. His hands clenched in his lap. He had been dreading this moment ever since he heard those words at the front desk, Chief Robinson. In his mind, he replayed the scene from earlier, the way he had dismissed him, the tone he used, and the spit. He told himself it was a mistake. Maybe the chief would let it slide. Maybe he wouldn't mention it at all. But then came the moment of truth. Chief Robinson adjusted the microphone. His gaze swept across the room. Not with arrogance, but with intent. He didn't look like he was here to lecture. He looked like he was here to lead. I want to start by saying thank you, he began. Thank you for your service to this department and to this community. A few heads nodded. I arrived here today ready to lead with dignity, respect, and integrity. I came in with a clear mission to build trust between this department and the people we serve. But something happened this morning. Something that reminded me why this work is so necessary. The room quieted further. The air became heavy. Chief Robinson paused, then continued, his voice steady and unshaken. Before I even stepped foot inside this building, one of your officers made it clear that I wasn't welcome. Murmurs rippled through the rows. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't offer help. Instead, he chose to assume, to judge, and even spit at me. Gasps echoed around the room like gunshots. A few officers turned their heads instinctively toward the back of the room, toward Jennings. Chief Robinson let the silence settle for a few seconds, not to embarrass, but to let the weight of his words sink in. And that, he said calmly, is the very culture I'm here to change. Jennings felt like the walls were closing in. His face turned a deep shade of red, and his throat went dry. He avoided eye contact, but he could feel the stares boring into him. Everyone knew. Everyone. Chief Robinson didn't name names. He didn't need to. What he offered wasn't anger. It was truth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't seek revenge. Instead, he laid out a vision. A vision of a police force where assumptions didn't cost people dignity, where judgment wasn't handed down before facts, where respect was given freely, not earned through fear. I'm not here to destroy this department, he said, his tone softening. I'm here to help us rebuild it, stronger, fairer, and worthy of the badge we wear. The room stayed silent, not out of fear, but reflection. For some, the message stung. For others, it inspired. And for Officer Jennings, it was a mirror, a moment he couldn't escape, a choice he would soon have to make. Because the days of silence and cover-ups were over. A new chapter had begun, and the first words had just been spoken. The moment the meeting ended, Chief Robinson quietly stepped away from the podium and returned to his office. He didn't storm through the halls or shout commands. He simply picked up the phone and made one request: start an internal review. Immediately. An hour later, an internal affairs officer pulled surveillance footage from the building's entrance. The video didn't lie. It captured every second of the encounter. Officer Mark Jennings confronting Chief Robinson, the aggressive posture, the dismissive words, and finally, the act that would seal his fate: the spit. No sound was needed. The body language said it all. Jennings was summoned to the captain's office. For the first time in years, the smirk he often wore was gone. He sat down with his shoulders hunched and his voice barely audible. Faced with undeniable proof, he confessed to everything. He tried to explain. He said he didn't know who the man was. That was a moment of bad judgment. But the truth was, his actions weren't a fluke. They were part of a pattern. And now, that pattern had come to light under a new chief who had no intention of sweeping things under the rug. Chief Robinson made a decision. Officer Jennings would be suspended without pay, pending a full disciplinary review. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't personal. It was about principle. If we want to earn the community's trust, Chief Robinson said at the press conference later that week, we must hold ourselves to the highest standard. No exceptions. And he meant it. Within days, the chief rolled out a wave of reforms. He introduced mandatory sensitivity and cultural awareness training, not just as a one-time session, but as an ongoing requirement. Every officer, from rookie to veteran, would be expected to complete it and pass. He launched monthly community walkthroughs where officers would walk, not drive, through neighborhoods, talking to residents, listening to their concerns, and rebuilding lost trust. He met with local church leaders, school principals, and small business owners to form a community advisory council, a group that would meet regularly with police leadership and have a direct line to the chief's office. But most importantly, he implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, no matter a person's rank, race, or record. Harassment, profiling, and abuse of authority would no longer be tolerated or ignored. At first, there was skepticism. Some officers grumbled. Others rolled their eyes. But something unexpected happened. Morale started to improve. Younger officers, who had once felt pressured to conform to an old, toxic culture, now felt empowered to speak up. Veterans who believed in integrity but had stayed silent for fear of backlash now had support. Within a few short weeks, more officers volunteered for community cookouts, youth mentoring programs, and neighborhood patrols. Even local residents, many of whom had long given up hope, started to notice the change. People began waving at patrol cars again. Kids stopped officers on the street to talk. Community members, Black, white, Latino, and more, began showing up to department events. The air felt lighter. The walls of mistrust began to crack. And what about Officer Jennings? At first, he stayed quiet, angry, embarrassed. But as the investigation wrapped up and the reforms began to take root, he slowly came to terms with the truth. He wasn't the victim. He was the wake-up call. Weeks later, in front of a modest crowd outside City Hall, Jennings stood at the microphone and delivered a public apology. Not because he had to, but because he finally understood. "I forgot what this badge meant," he said. "It's not about power. It's about people. I lost sight of that. But I'm here to say, I'm ready to learn." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, Chief Robinson stepped forward. He didn't shake Jennings' hand, but he did nod. A small gesture, a sign that change was possible. Chief David Robinson didn't let that ugly incident outside the station define his first day. He could have lashed out. He could have let anger guide his next move. But instead, he saw something greater than insult. He saw opportunity. An opportunity to send a message, not just to his department, but to the entire town. This stops now. But Robinson wasn't there to play judge and jury. He wasn't interested in quick revenge or public shaming. What he wanted, what he always fought for, was accountability with purpose. So, he did something most didn't expect. He didn't fire Officer Jennings on the spot. No grand punishment. No cameras. No press conference. Instead, he called Jennings into his office, sat across from him, looked him directly in the eye, and gave him a choice. "You can leave," Robinson said calmly. "Or you can face discipline, own up to what happened, and do the work to become the kind of officer this community deserves." For the first time in years, Jennings was speechless. He wasn't being let off the hook. Far from it. He would still be suspended, still face the consequences. But he was also being handed something rare, a path to redemption. The choice was his. Word spread through the department quickly. Not just about the punishment, but about the principle behind it. Robinson wasn't just cleaning house. He was planting seeds. And slowly, things began to change. The chief doubled down on his promise. He launched department-wide reforms, opened listening sessions with the community, and made sure that every officer, from rookies to veterans, understood one truth. This badge isn't a symbol of power. It's a promise of service. The community, long skeptical of law enforcement, began to take notice. Officers were showing up differently, walking neighborhoods, not just patrolling, talking with locals, not just ticketing them. They weren't hiding behind their uniforms. They were learning to be present, to listen, and to lead with empathy. And surprisingly, the story didn't stay local. Someone who had witnessed the confrontation on the station steps had quietly recorded part of it and later posted the clip online. Captioned simply, "New police chief gets spat on and still leads with grace." Within days, the video exploded across social media. News outlets picked it up, not because of the shock. Plenty of shocking things happen online, but because of something deeper, hope. In a world where outrage often drowns out progress, here was a story about dignity, about strength, and about how even broken systems can heal when leaders choose courage over silence. People didn't just share the video, they talked about it. Teachers used it as a lesson in schools. Pastors spoke about it in sermons. Local citizens, inspired by the story, came forward with their own ideas for building bridges between law enforcement and the community. Jennings, for his part, kept his head down. He completed every training, met with counselors, sat through community panels. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't supposed to be. But something in him shifted, too. Eventually, he stood in front of his fellow officers and addressed what he had done. Not with excuses, but with ownership. "I failed," he said. "Not just Chief Robinson, not just this badge, but all of you. And I'm here because I want to do better." The room was quiet. And then, one by one, his fellow officers nodded. Because by then, they'd already seen what real leadership looked like. Chief Robinson turned a moment of hate into a movement of healing. He didn't just lead a department. He changed a culture. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching, inside and outside the badge, that change doesn't always start with a roar. Sometimes, it starts with one man refusing to spit back.